The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled in and out, settling into their places. Judge Blake William, a man in his early 50s with an air of authority and fairness, adjusted his glasses and scanned the docket for the day. His routine was predictable, the cases blending together after years of presiding over them. But today was about to be anything but ordinary. The next case was brought forward, a guardianship hearing involving an 11-year-old girl named Emma Claire. As Blake read the file, his brow furrowed slightly. The girl had spent her entire life in the foster care system after losing her mother 2 years ago. Blake prided himself on maintaining emotional distance in his courtroom, but there was something about this case that tugged at him in an unfamiliar way. Emma entered the room, clutching a worn-out teddy bear in one hand and a small backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked around, frowned nervously, her wide brown eyes darting from one face to another until they settled on Blake. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, fear, hope, and determination all rolled into one. Her foster advocate gently nudged her forward. "It's okay, Emma. You can do this," the woman whispered. Emma took a deep breath, her tiny frame trembling as she stepped up to the stand. She glanced down at her teddy bear for reassurance before looking up at the judge. Blake noticed her hesitation and softened his tone. "Take your time, young lady," he said, his voice calm and steady. I have something to say," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom went silent, every eye on her. Blake leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "You may speak," he encouraged. Emma swallowed hard, gripping the bear tighter. "Your Honor, before this hearing goes any further, I need to tell you something important." Blake raised an eyebrow, his gaze fixed on her. "Go on," he said, his tone measured but curious. Emma's next words sent a shockwave through the room. "You're my dad," she blurted out, her voice trembling but steady. The murmurs in the courtroom ceased instantly, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. Blake blinked, his composure momentarily shattered. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" he asked, his usually steady voice wavering slightly. "You're my dad," Emma repeated, her words firmer now. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded letter. "My mom wrote this before she died. She said you're my father." The weight of her statement hung in the air, palpable and undeniable. Blake sat frozen, the letter in her small hands drawing his attention like a magnet. For the first time in years, he found himself at a loss for words. "I have proof," Emma added, her tone tinged with desperation. "Please, Your Honor, just read the letter." Blake motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the letter, his heart pounding in his chest as he unfolded it with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the words, and the courtroom seemed to fade away. The handwriting was unmistakably that of Naomi Parker, a woman he had loved deeply many years ago. The letter detailed a secret she had kept for over a decade, a child she had chosen to raise alone, fearing the impact it might have on his career. Blake's world tilted on its axis. He struggled to reconcile the child standing before him with the life he thought he knew. Who was this brave, trembling girl who had just upended his existence with a few simple words? "Recess," Blake announced abruptly, his voice cracking. He stood, his gavel forgotten, and quickly exited the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned silence and a little girl clutching her teddy bear, her gaze never leaving him. Blake sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the letter in his hands making it feel heavier than paper should. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the courtroom beyond the door. His chest felt tight, his thoughts tangled and frantic as he unfolded the letter again. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant, flowing script he hadn't seen in over a decade. It belonged to Naomi Parker, a woman he once cared for deeply. Memories of her flooded back, her warm laughter, her sharp wit, and the way she always made him feel like he could conquer the world. But those memories were tinged with a bittersweet ache now, as her words stared back at him from the page. Blake sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the letter in his hands making it feel heavier than paper should. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the courtroom beyond the door. His chest felt tight, his thoughts tangled and frantic as he unfolded the letter again. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, flowing script he hadn't seen in over a decade. It belonged to Naomi Parker, a woman he once cared for deeply. Memories of her flooded back, her warm laughter, her sharp wit, and the way she always made him feel like he could conquer the world. But those memories were tinged with a bittersweet ache now, as her words stared back at him from the page. "Do!" Blake's hands shook as he set the letter down on his desk, a wave of emotions crashing over him. Shock, guilt, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. How had he not known? Why hadn't Naomi told him? And this girl, Emma, his daughter. The words echoed in his mind, refusing to settle. His daughter. He pressed his palms against his face, trying to steady his breathing. He had spent years building a reputation as a fair and composed judge. But this moment felt like it was tearing him apart. The realization that he had unknowingly missed over a decade of his child's life was a pain he couldn't describe. A soft knock on the door broke his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. It was his clerk, a kind older woman named Mrs. Turner. "Your Honor, are you all right?" she asked gently. He nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "I need a moment, Mrs. Turner. Please reschedule the afternoon cases." And he hesitated. "Ask the bailiff to bring Emma and her advocate to my chambers." Mrs. Turner gave a small nod and left quietly, leaving Blake to gather himself. He took a deep breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back into its envelope. Whatever questions he had, there was only one person who could provide the answers now. A few minutes later, there was another knock, and the door opened. Emma stepped in hesitantly, clutching her teddy bear, her foster advocate following closely behind. Blake rose from his chair, his towering presence softened by the vulnerability in his eyes. "Please come in," he said gently, motioning for them to sit on the couch opposite his desk. Emma perched on the edge of the seat, her small hands gripping the bear tightly. Blake sat down across from her, folding his hands in his lap. For a moment he didn't speak, simply observing the young girl in front of him. She had Naomi's eyes, dark and expressive, and her quiet determination. "Emma," he began softly, his voice almost breaking, "I read your mother's letter." Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. "She told me about you. She said you didn't know, but that you were a good man." Blake swallowed hard. "Your mother was an incredible woman. I didn't know about you. And if I had," he stopped, his words catching in his throat, "I would have wanted to be there for you." Emma's lips trembled, and for the first time tears filled her eyes. Do you believe me?" she whispered. Blake leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Yes, Emma, I believe you. I have no doubt." A small sob escaped her, and she wiped her eyes quickly, as if embarrassed. I thought you might not want me." The words cut through Blake like a knife. He reached out, hesitating for only a second before placing his hand gently on hers. "I want you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how to make up for the years we lost, but I want to know you if you'll let me. I'd like to be the father you deserve." Emma stared at him, her tears falling freely now. For the first time in years she felt a spark of hope. She nodded slowly, her grip on the teddy bear loosening as she allowed herself to trust. As the conversation continued, Blake asked about her life, her favorite books, what she liked to do for fun, and her memories of her mother. Emma spoke quietly at first, but as the minutes passed, she began to open up. For Blake, every word was a revelation, every detail a glimpse into the life he hadn't known existed. He knew there was a long road ahead, filled with challenges and questions, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't let her go again. "Emma," he said as they wrapped up their conversation, "I'd like to meet with you again soon. We have a lot to figure out, but I'm here for you, always." For the first time, Emma smiled, a small, tentative smile that lit up her face. "Okay," she said softly, And in that moment, Blake knew that everything had changed. The next day, Blake arrived at his office early, unable to shake the events of the previous day. The courtroom felt heavier than usual, the weight of his newfound reality pressing on him. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself, not as a judge, but as a person. He spent the morning sifting through legal. Documents and files occupied his mind, but thoughts of Emma intruded constantly. Questions swirled in his head like a storm. Why had Naomi kept her a secret? What kind of life had Emma endured in foster care? And most pressing of all, how could he begin to make up for the years he had missed? That afternoon, Blake arranged a private meeting with Emma and her foster advocate, Miss Taylor. They sat in a small, cozy conference room, a choice Blake made intentionally to make Emma feel more at ease. He wanted her to know this wasn't just another case. It was personal. Emma sat across from him, her teddy bear once again clutched tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, but determined. Miss Taylor placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder and gave Blake a small nod, signaling it was okay to start. Blake cleared his throat, his deep voice softer than usual. "Emma, thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I wanted us to have a chance to talk outside of the courtroom." Emma nodded, her wide eyes watching him carefully. "Okay," she said softly. He took a deep breath. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what you said yesterday, and I need you to know something. None of this is your fault. You've been incredibly brave coming here and sharing your story. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Emma's lips trembled slightly, but she stayed silent. Blake continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I also want you to know that I'm taking this seriously. I've read your mother's letter several times. I believe her, and I believe you. But I need your help to understand everything that's happened." Emma hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Miss Taylor, who gave her an encouraging nod. "My mom, she never talked about you when I was little," Emma began, her voice small but clear. "She always said we didn't need anyone else, that we had each other." Blake nodded, feeling a pang of guilt at the thought of Naomi carrying such a burden alone. "She was really good at making me feel safe," Emma continued, her eyes lowering to her teddy bear. "But then she got sick. At first she said it wasn't a big deal, but she started getting tired all the time. She couldn't work, and things got really hard. That's when she told me about you." Blake's throat tightened. He couldn't imagine how scared Emma must have been during that time. "What did she tell you?" he asked gently. "She said you were a judge, and that you were a good man. That you didn't know about me because she didn't want to hold you back. She said it wasn't because you wouldn't have cared. It was because she didn't want you to feel trapped." Emma's voice wavered slightly, but she also said she thought you would love me if you knew. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over them. Blake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "She was right," he said quietly. "I didn't know. But if I had, I would have been there for you. I want you to know that, Emma. You deserve so much more, and I'm sorry I wasn't there." Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't blame you," she said softly. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to grow up not knowing my dad." Blake turned his attention to Miss Taylor, who had been sitting quietly throughout the conversation. "Miss Taylor, can you tell me more about Emma's situation in foster care? I need to understand what she's been through." Miss Taylor nodded. "After Naomi passed, Emma was placed with a foster family, but it wasn't an ideal situation. The family wasn't abusive, but they weren't particularly nurturing either. She's been in 2 other homes since then, and while her current placement is better, it's not permanent." Blake's jaw tightened. "She's been moved around 3 times in 2 years." Miss Taylor nodded again. "Unfortunately, that's not uncommon in the system. Emma has been resilient, but it hasn't been easy for her. She's had to adapt to new environments and people constantly." Blake turned back to Emma, his heart breaking for the little girl who had been through so much. "Emma, I promise you this. You won't have to move again if I can help it." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You mean—" I want to be part of your life," Blake said firmly. "I don't know exactly what that will look like yet, but we'll figure it out together." As the meeting ended, Blake walked Emma and Miss Taylor to the door. Before leaving, Emma turned to him, her voice hesitant but filled with newfound confidence. "Thank you," she said quietly. Blake knelt down to her level, his eyes meeting hers. "No, Emma. Thank you for being brave enough to find me." As she left, Blake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do everything in his power to make things right for Emma. Their journey was just beginning, and he was determined not to let her down. The sun streamed through the windows of Blake's office the next morning, but he barely noticed. He was lost in thought, the events of the past 2 days replaying in his mind like a movie. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to separate his personal feelings from his role as a judge, but now the lines had blurred in a way he could have never anticipated. Sitting at his desk, Blake held Naomi's letter once again, running his fingers over the worn edges of the paper. He had read it so many times that the words were etched into his memory, yet it still felt unreal. How could Naomi have gone through so much alone? How could he have missed the signs of her struggle all those years ago? The guilt was overwhelming. He thought of all the moments he had missed, Emma's first words, her first steps, her birthdays. He imagined her waiting for a father she didn't even know, and felt a deep ache in his chest. Blake leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. How do I make up for lost time? He wondered. He knew he couldn't rewrite the past, but he was determined to make the future count. Later that day, Blake visited his lifelong friend and mentor, Gerald Carter, a retired judge who had always been a source of wisdom. They sat in Gerald's study, surrounded by rows of law books and family photographs. Blake explained everything: Naomi's letter, Emma's brave confession, and his own swirling emotions. Gerald listened patiently, nodding thoughtfully. When Blake finished, Gerald leaned forward, his expression kind but firm. "Blake," he began, "you've spent your whole career upholding justice and fairness for others, but this is personal. You're not just a judge in Emma's life now. You're her father. That comes with its own responsibilities." "I know," Blake replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But how do I even begin? I've missed so much. She doesn't really know me, and I don't know her. What if I fail her?" Gerald placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The fact that you're asking these questions shows you care, and that's the first step. You can't change the past, Blake, but you can show her that you're here now. And being there, that's what matters most." Taking Gerald's advice to heart, Blake reached out to Miss Taylor and asked to spend more time with Emma in a comfortable, informal setting. They arranged to meet at a local park the following weekend. When Blake arrived, he saw Emma sitting on a bench, her teddy bear beside her. She looked up as he approached, her expression nervous but hopeful. "Hi, Emma," Blake said, his tone warm and inviting. "Hi," she replied quietly. "I thought we could talk and maybe do something fun today," he said, holding up a frisbee he'd brought along. Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay." They started with small talk as they tossed the frisbee back and forth. At first, the conversation was awkward, filled with short answers and long silences. But as the game continued, Emma began to open up. "I used to play this with my mom," she said, catching the frisbee with surprising skill. "Really?" Blake asked, smiling. "You're pretty good at it. Did she teach you?" Emma nodded, her eyes lighting up. "Yeah, we'd play in the yard after school. She always said I had a great arm." Blake chuckled. "She was right. You've got a better throw than I do." For the first time, Emma laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made Blake's heart swell. As the sun began to set, they sat on the bench again, watching the color streak across the sky. Emma clutched her teddy bear, her gaze distant. "Do you miss her?" Blake asked gently. Emma nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day. She was my best friend." Blake hesitated before speaking, unsure. If his words would be enough, I didn't know about you, Emma. But if I had, I would have been there. I would have done everything I could to help your mom and be part of your life. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Do you think she'd be okay with this? With me being here with you? Blake swallowed the lump in his throat. I think she'd want us to have this chance to get to know each other, and I think she'd be proud of how brave you are. A single tear slipped down Emma's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. I don't know if I'm brave, she said softly. You are, Blake said firmly. Coming to me, telling me the truth. That takes courage, and I'm so proud of you for it. Emma managed a small smile, her first real one of the day. They walked back to the parking lot. Emma held her teddy bear tightly but stayed close to Blake. Before she got into Miss Taylor's car, she turned to him. Can we do this again? She asked hesitantly. Blake knelt down to her level, his gaze steady. Absolutely. Anytime you want. She nodded, her smile growing just a little wider as the car pulled away. Blake stood there watching until it disappeared from view. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Emma, but for the relationship they were starting to build. He knew there were challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. This was the beginning of something new, something he wouldn't take for granted. For Emma and for himself, he was determined to make it work. The following week, Blake found himself adjusting to his new role as more than just a judge. He was now a father. The thought still felt foreign, but every time he pictured Emma's shy smile and the way she'd asked, "Can we do this again?" it gave him strength. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it one step at a time. First, Blake knew he needed to address Emma's guardianship. While her foster placement was stable, it wasn't permanent, and the idea of her continuing to move from one home to another was unbearable. He reached out to Miss Taylor to discuss the process of becoming Emma's legal guardian. Blake, Miss Taylor said during a phone call, her tone cautious. You have to understand that this isn't just about paperwork. Emma has been through a lot. She's still grieving her mother and adjusting to the idea of having a father. You'll need to prove not only your ability to care for her, but also that this is what's best for her emotionally. I understand, Blake replied firmly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. She deserves stability, and I want to give her that. Miss Taylor sighed. I believe you mean that, and it's a good start, but it'll take time, and Emma needs to feel safe every step of the way. She's been let down before. Blake felt the weight of her words, but remained resolute. I won't let her down, he said quietly. To strengthen their bond, Blake decided to invite Emma over for dinner at his home. He spent the afternoon preparing her favorite meal, which Miss Taylor had mentioned, spaghetti and meatballs. As he set the table, he caught himself wondering if she'd like the house, if it would feel welcoming to her. When Miss Taylor arrived with Emma, Blake greeted them at the door, his nerves hidden behind a warm smile. Emma stepped inside hesitantly, clutching her teddy bear. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the neatly arranged furniture and family photos on the walls. This is your house? She asked softly. Blake nodded. It is, but tonight it's your house too. She smiled faintly and followed him into the dining room. Over dinner, Blake did his best to make Emma feel at ease. He asked her about her favorite books and movies, and she gradually opened up, sharing that she loved fantasy stories and had a soft spot for superhero movies. I used to watch those with my mom, she said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. She loved the ones with strong women like Wonder Woman. Blake chuckled. Your mom had great taste. I've always liked the ones where the hero finds their strength in unexpected ways. Emma tilted her head, considering his words. Like what? Well, Blake said, leaning back in his chair. Sometimes it's not about superpowers or fighting bad guys. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to face the hard things, like you did when you came to see me in court. Emma looked down, a small blush creeping across her cheeks. I didn't feel brave, she admitted. But you were, Blake said firmly. And that's what matters. After dinner, Blake brought out an old photo album he hadn't opened in years. He flipped through the pages, showing Emma pictures of himself as a young man, his family, and even some old colleagues from law school. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw a photo of her mother. It was from a time when Blake and Naomi had been together, her face glowing with happiness. "That's her," Emma whispered, her fingers gently brushing the photo. Blake nodded, his throat tightening. "She was amazing," he said softly, "and she loved you so much." They spent the next hour looking through the album, sharing stories and memories. For the first time, Emma began to feel like she was part of something, a family history that was hers to share. The evening wound down. Blake walked Emma to the door. Just as they were about to say goodbye, Miss Taylor's phone buzzed with a message. Her expression grew serious as she read it. "What's wrong?" Blake asked. "There's a hearing scheduled for Emma's long-term placement," Miss Taylor explained. "Her current foster family has expressed interest in adopting her." Blake's stomach dropped. "But I'm her father. Doesn't that change things?" Miss Taylor sighed. "It does. But the system doesn't work that quickly. You'll need to prove that taking custody is in Emma's best interest, and the foster family has been caring for her for over a year. They have a strong case." Blake glanced at Emma, who was looking between him and Miss Taylor, with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What does that mean for me?" she asked quietly. Blake knelt down to her level, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It means we have to fight, but I'm not giving up. You're my daughter, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you're with me." That night, Blake stayed up late, poring over legal documents and contacting his lawyer. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Emma down. As he closed the last file and turned off his desk lamp, he thought of her small smile and the way she had asked, "Can we do this again?" "Yes, we can," he whispered to himself, "and we will." The announcement of the custody hearing sent shock waves through Blake's life. The thought of losing Emma to another family felt unbearable, especially after everything they had started to build together. He knew he had a long road ahead, filled with legal obstacles and emotional challenges, but he was ready to fight for his daughter. Blake spent the next few days tirelessly preparing for the custody hearing. He worked closely with his lawyer, Laura Bennett, a sharp and experienced family law attorney. Laura listened attentively as Blake explained everything: his relationship with Emma, Naomi's letter, and the DNA results that confirmed their bond. "Your connection to her is undeniable," Laura said during one of their meetings. "But the court will want to see that you're prepared to take full custody. It's not just about biology, it's about stability and what's best for Emma." Blake nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes. I want to give her the home and the family she deserves." Laura offered a reassuring smile. "We'll focus on your strengths, your ability to provide, your willingness to connect with her emotionally, and the fact that she's already starting to bond with you. The foster family has been good to her, but they're not her father. You are." In the days leading up to the hearing, Blake dedicated himself to proving he could be the parent Emma needed. He met with a child psychologist who conducted an evaluation to ensure he was emotionally equipped for the responsibility. He also gathered character references from colleagues, friends, and even Gerald Carter, his retired judge mentor. Meanwhile, Blake made sure to spend as much time with Emma as possible. They went on walks, worked on puzzles, and even baked cookies together, though the kitchen ended up covered in flour and laughter. "Are you always this bad at baking?" Emma teased as she dusted flour off her teddy bear. "Hey, I'm a judge, not a chef," Blake replied, grinning. Moments like these reminded Blake why he was fighting so hard. Emma wasn't just his daughter. She was quickly becoming the center of his world. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was tense. Blake sat beside Laura, glancing over at Emma, who was seated with her foster advocate. She looked nervous, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her lap. The foster family presented their case first. They described how they had cared for Emma for over a year, providing her with a stable home and a nurturing environment. Their lawyer emphasized that Emma had formed bonds with their children and was thriving under their care. Blake couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he listened. The foster family clearly cared about Emma, and he was grateful for the role they had played in her life. But he also knew that he was her father and he couldn't let her go without a fight. When it was Blake's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and stepped up to the witness stand. Laura guided him through the questions, allowing him to explain his perspective to the judge. "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice steady. "I didn't know about Emma until recently. If I had, I would have been there for her from the very beginning. But now that I do know, I'm fully committed to being the father she needs." He described the steps he had taken to build a relationship with Emma and the plans he had for her future: a stable home, access to education, and above all, unconditional love. When the opposing lawyer cross-examined him, they questioned his ability to transition from being a single man with a demanding career to a full-time parent. "I've spent my life balancing responsibility and dedication," Blake replied firmly. "Being a father is the most important responsibility I'll ever have, and I'm ready for it." The turning point of the hearing came when Emma was asked to speak. The judge gave her the option to share her thoughts, and after a moment of hesitation, she nodded. Emma stood up, her small frame dwarfed by the courtroom's imposing walls. She looked at Blake, then at the foster family, and finally at the judge. "I'm really grateful for everything my foster family has done for me," she began, her voice steady but soft. "But I've always wanted to know my dad, and now that I do, I don't want to lose him." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that brought tears to Blake's eyes. "I feel safe with him," Emma continued. "He listens to me, and he tries really hard to make me feel like I belong. I know it's new, but I think he really cares about me, and I care about him too." After closing arguments, the judge announced a recess to deliberate. The room fell silent as everyone waited for the decision that would shape Emma's future. Blake sat with his hands clasped tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. When the judge returned, they addressed the room with calm authority. "This is not an easy decision," they began. "Both parties have shown their dedication to Emma's well-being, and it's clear that she is loved. However, given the biological relationship and the effort demonstrated by Mr. Hensley to build a bond with his daughter, I find that awarding custody to him is in Emma's best interest." A collective breath filled the room, and Blake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He glanced at Emma, who was already smiling through her tears. The hearing concluded, Blake knelt down and opened his arms. Emma ran into them without hesitation, holding him tightly. "You did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "No," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it together." For the first time in years, Blake felt like his life had purpose beyond the courtroom. Emma was his family, and their journey was just beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as father and daughter together. The decision in the courtroom marked the beginning of a new chapter for Blake and Emma. While the victory had been emotional and empowering, both knew the real work was just starting. They were now officially father and daughter, and their lives were about to intertwine in ways neither had experienced before. The day Emma moved into Blake's home was a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Blake had spent the days leading up to it preparing her room, filling it with books, a colorful bedspread, and small decorations he thought she might like. When Emma arrived, clutching her teddy bear in a small suitcase, her eyes widened as she stepped inside. "This is mine?" she asked softly, looking around the room. Blake knelt down beside her. "All yours, and if there's anything you want to add or change, just let me know. This is your home now." Emma set her teddy bear on the bed and ran her fingers over the bookshelf. "I've never had a room like this before," she admitted, her voice tinged with both awe and hesitation. "Well," Blake said with a smile, "you deserve it. This is just the start." The first few weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Emma was used to the rules and routines of foster care, where everything was structured and impersonal. Blake, on the other hand, was navigating the challenges of being a single father for the first time. There were moments of trial and error, forgotten lunchboxes, bedtime negotiations, and even a burnt dinner or two. But there were also moments of joy, laughter over board games, shared stories about Naomi, and quiet evenings reading together on the couch. One evening, as Blake tucked Emma in, She hesitated before speaking. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" she asked, her voice small. Blake looked at her, his expression softening. "Why would you ask that?" I don't want to mess things up," she said, hugging her teddy bear tightly. Blake sat beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma, you're not messing anything up. We're figuring this out together, and I wouldn't trade this for anything. You're my daughter, and that's all that matters." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, a small smile forming. "Okay," she whispered. Adjusting to her new school proved to be another hurdle. Emma struggled to fit in, often feeling out of place among her peers. She was quiet and kept to herself, something her teacher noted in a parent-teacher meeting. "She's very bright," the teacher said, glancing at Blake. "But she seems hesitant to connect with other kids. It's not uncommon given her background, but it might take some time for her to feel comfortable." Blake nodded, taking in the feedback. That evening, he brought up the conversation with Emma. "How's school going for you?" he asked as they cleaned up after dinner. "It's okay," she said, shrugging. "I just don't know what to say to people. I don't want them asking about my mom or foster care." Blake understood. "You don't have to explain anything to anyone if you don't want to," he said gently. "But it's okay to let people in when you're ready. You're a great kid, Emma. Anyone would be lucky to be your friend." Emma gave a small nod, his words sinking in. One weekend, Blake surprised Emma with tickets to a local art fair. He knew she loved drawing and hoped it would be a chance for her to relax and have fun. As they wandered through the colorful stalls, Emma's eyes lit up at the vibrant paintings and handcrafted items. At one booth, an artist was giving free drawing lessons to kids. Blake nudged Emma gently. "Want to give it a try?" She hesitated but then nodded, stepping forward with a mix of curiosity and excitement. As she sketched, Blake watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time, she seemed truly at ease, her natural talent shining through. When the session ended, the artist handed her the drawing. "You're really talented," he said with a smile. "Keep at it, Emma," beamed as she showed Blake her work. "What do you think?" "I think it's amazing," Blake said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You're amazing." That evening, as they sat together looking through her new sketch pad, Emma asked a question that caught Blake off guard. "What was my mom like?" "When you knew her?" Blake paused, a bittersweet smile forming. "She was incredible, smart, funny, and strong. She loved deeply and she always wanted the best for you." Emma listened intently, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Blake reached out, placing a hand on hers. "I know she would. She'd be proud of how brave you are, how kind you are, and how much you've grown." For the first time, Emma seemed to believe it. She leaned against Blake, her head resting on his shoulder. "I'm glad I found you," she said quietly. Blake's heart swelled. "I'm glad you did too." As the days turned into weeks, Blake and Emma began to find their rhythm. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges and moments of doubt, but their bond grew stronger with each passing day. For Blake, being a father was no longer an unfamiliar role. It was the most important part of his life. And for Emma, the once lonely girl with a teddy bear, life finally felt like it was filled with hope, love, and the beginnings of a true family. Months had passed since the custody hearing, and life for Blake and Emma was beginning to feel steady, even joyful. Their once nervous interactions had blossomed into a bond filled with trust, laughter, and a sense of belonging. Yet, there was one final piece of their story that Blake felt needed closure: Emma's connection to Naomi. One sunny Saturday morning, Blake knocked on Emma's bedroom door, holding a box wrapped in a soft blue ribbon. She looked up from her sketch pad as he entered, her face lighting up with curiosity. "What's that?" she asked, setting her pencil down. Blake placed the box on her bed and sat beside her. "It's something I've been meaning to share with you. I've been holding on to these for a long time, and I think it's time you have them." Emma carefully untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, she found photographs, letters, and small keepsakes from Blake's time with Naomi. There were candid snapshots of them laughing together, letters Naomi had written but never sent, and even a bracelet she used to wear, a simple silver chain with a tiny heart charm. "She wore this all the time," Emma said, her voice soft as she held the bracelet in her hands. "She did," Blake replied. "She loved it. She said it reminded her of you, even before you were born." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I miss her so much." Blake wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I know you do, and I want you to know it's okay to miss her. She's a part of you, and always will be." Later that day, Blake asked Emma if she would like to visit Naomi's grave. She nodded, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. Together, they drove to the cemetery, carrying a bouquet of bright yellow daisies, Naomi's favorite flowers. Standing by the headstone, Emma placed the flowers gently on the grave. She stared at the inscription for a long moment before speaking. "Hi, Mom," she said quietly. "It's me, Emma. I wanted you to know I found him. I found Dad, and he's everything you said he'd be. He's kind, and he cares about me. I think you'd be proud of us." Blake stood beside her, his throat tight with emotion. He placed a hand on her shoulder as she continued. "I'll never forget you," Emma whispered, "but I'm happy now. I have Dad, and I think I'm going to be okay." After the visit, they spent the rest of the afternoon at a nearby park, sitting on a bench by the lake. Emma leaned her head against Blake's arm, her teddy bear in her lap, as they watched the water ripple in the breeze. "Do you think she knows?" Emma asked suddenly. "Knows what?" Blake replied. "That we're okay, that we're a family now." Blake smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think she knows, and I think she's proud of you, of both of us." Emma tilted her head up to look at him. "I'm glad you found me, Dad." Blake's heart swelled at the word. "I'm glad you found me too, sweetheart. You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." As the weeks turned into months, Blake and Emma continued to grow together. Emma excelled in school, her confidence blooming as she made friends and pursued her passion for art. Blake took every opportunity to support her, attending school events, encouraging her creativity, and always reminding her how proud he was. One evening, as they sat together looking through one of Emma's sketchbooks, she handed him a drawing. It was a simple but heartfelt piece, a picture of the two of them holding hands, with the word family written above. Blake stared at the drawing, his eyes misting. "This is beautiful, Emma. I'm going to frame it." "You really like it?" she asked shyly. "I love it," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Just like I love you." The journey that had begun with uncertainty and loss had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, a bond stronger than either had ever known. For Emma, Blake had become a steady presence, a protector, and a father in every sense of the word. And for Blake, Emma had given his life a depth and purpose he never realized was missing. As they sat together that night, sharing stories and laughter, Blake felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. For the first time, both of them felt whole, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold together. This story reminds us that life is full of unexpected twists, and sometimes the bonds we create through love and understanding can be even stronger than those forged by time. Blake and Emma's journey shows that no matter how much has been lost, it's never too late to rebuild, reconnect, and create a future filled with hope and family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, love, and the beauty of second chances. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.